It was one of those cold nights when the city lights glittered like jewels, but for Clara they only reflected her emptiness. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but pride had always stopped her from begging. She had walked aimlessly past glowing restaurants, her throat tightening every time laughter and the smell of warm food spilled out. The world seemed divided by glass, those inside with abundance, and those like her outside with nothing. Her shoes were thin, her coat frayed, and her face pale from exhaustion. She hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, and though she had endured hunger before, tonight it felt unbearable. Just as she was about to retreat into the shadows, a tall man in a sharp suit stepped out of one of the restaurants, holding a neat paper bag. His aura screamed wealth, the polished watch, the confident stride, the expensive shoes. Clara's lips trembled as she forced herself to whisper, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" The words felt heavy, humiliating, but she had no other choice. Adrian Cole, a man known for his success and coldness, stopped mid-step. He had heard requests before, people often tried to tug at his wealth, but something about this was different. Her voice wasn't demanding, it was soft, almost apologetic, as if she was ashamed of asking. He looked at her properly for the first time. Her clothes were worn, but her eyes were alive, holding a quiet dignity that unsettled him. For a moment, he thought of walking away, dismissing it as just another street encounter, but his hand tightened on the bag. Slowly, he extended it toward her. Clara accepted it as though he had given her the world. She didn't snatch it greedily, instead, she held it carefully, opened it with trembling hands, and ate each bite with gratitude, savoring it like a feast. Adrian stood there, longer than he intended, watching her as she smiled faintly between bites, whispering thanks she thought he couldn't hear. A strange tug stirred in his chest, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He could have left, but curiosity pinned him in place. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone clipped yet softened by interest. She looked up, startled that he even cared enough to ask. "Clara," she replied, her voice steady despite her situation. Adrian studied her, expecting bitterness, but instead she met his gaze with calmness. Against his instincts, he felt the urge to know more. Offering her money seemed the logical next step, but when he did, Clara shook her head. "I only asked for food, sir, not charity," she said quietly. The words struck him harder than he expected. People always wanted more from him, investments, donations, favors, but here was someone who asked for the bare minimum and refused anything beyond. He hesitated, then gestured toward his car parked nearby. "At least let me give you a ride. Where do you need to go?" Clara blinked in surprise, unsure if he was mocking her. But there was a sincerity in his voice that made her nod cautiously. She stepped into the luxurious car, its warmth and comfort so alien to her world that it felt unreal. Adrian drove without speaking at first, stealing glances at her. She sat straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, not begging, not crying, just quiet. Finally, he asked about her situation, and as she spoke, her story unfolded like a tapestry of pain and resilience. Her parents had died young, debts swallowed what little they had, and though she worked tirelessly, life never gave her reprieve. Yet despite everything, Clara's voice carried hope, as if she still believed tomorrow could be better. Adrian listened in silence, feeling an odd sense of shame at his own life, overflowing with wealth yet barren of meaning. When she finally asked to be dropped at a rundown shelter, he stopped the car. Before she stepped out, he slipped his business card into her hand. "If you ever need help, call me," he said. She gave a small smile, tucked it away, and walked into the night, leaving Adrian with an unfamiliar ache in his chest, as though her quiet dignity had unsettled the very foundation of his soul. The card he had given her weighed on his mind for days, though she never used it. Adrian found himself checking his phone more often than usual, almost expecting a call that never came. He was a man who commanded attention everywhere he went, yet here was someone who had walked away without asking for anything more. That puzzled him deeply. On sleepless nights, her face surfaced in his thoughts, the faint smile, the hunger in her eyes, and the quiet pride in her refusal of money. Something about her story had cracked the shell of indifference he had built around himself. He had lived his life in skyscrapers, boardrooms, and private jets, believing power and wealth defined him. But now he wondered why a girl with nothing could speak with such strength and leave him feeling empty. One evening, while reviewing documents in his office, his eyes drifted toward the small card tray on his desk, where countless business cards lay stacked neatly. Among them, the one he had given Clara burned in his mind. He considered sending someone to find her, but quickly dismissed the thought. It wasn't about control or rescue, it was about something else, something he couldn't name yet. He shook off the distraction, burying himself in work, but his heart carried a quiet unrest. The answer to that restlessness came unexpectedly at a charity gala weeks later. The ballroom gleamed with chandeliers, the air thick with perfume, and the wealthy mingled with glasses of champagne in hand. Adrian moved through the crowd, offering his practiced smiles, but none of it touched him. Then, across the hall, his gaze froze. She was there, Clara. Not as a guest, but wearing a plain apron, serving trays of food to attendees. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks, but it was undeniably her. She balanced the tray with grace, her posture steady, her expression calm even as people ignored her. A wave of surprise rushed through him. Why hadn't she called him? Why was she here, working when she could have asked for help? He excused himself from a group of investors and walked toward her. When she noticed him, her eyes widened in shock, and a flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. She lowered her gaze quickly, as if wishing to disappear among the servers. Adrian reached her, blocking her path gently with his presence. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. She hesitated, unsure how to respond in such an opulent setting. "I didn't expect to see you here," he added, his tone tinged with something only she could unravel. "I'm working," she murmured, keeping her eyes fixed on the tray, as though ashamed to be seen by him in this role. But Adrian refused to let her shrink away. In doing it with more grace than most people in this room, he replied, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Heads turned. The wealthy crowd, who had overlooked her as just another server, now saw her through Adrian's words. He introduced her to his companions not as a worker or a stranger but as someone extraordinary. Clara's cheeks burned, but she couldn't deny the sincerity in his eyes. That night, he stayed near her, speaking to her in breaks, listening as she told him about volunteering at shelters despite her struggles. She explained how giving her time was her way of surviving, of staying human in a world that often stripped people of compassion. Adrian listened, humbled. He had spent fortunes on charities but had never truly given himself. She, with nothing, gave everything she could. As the gala ended, Adrian walked her out to the street, ignoring the curious stares of his peers. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. Clara didn't need saving, and that realization struck him harder than anything. What she needed was someone to see her, and somehow, that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Adrian had always believed transformation came from power, from signing a check or launching a project, but Clara revealed another truth: change began with the smallest act of kindness. After the gala, he couldn't return to his life the same way. Something inside him had shifted. The next morning, instead of attending a board meeting, he found himself standing outside the shelter Clara had mentioned that night in the car. The building was small, its paint peeling, but inside he saw her laughing softly with children as she handed out bowls of soup. For a while he just watched, unnoticed, stunned by how someone who had so little could give so much of herself. Eventually she saw him and walked over, surprise etched on her face. "You came," she said simply. Adrian nodded, unable to explain that he felt pulled there by something beyond reason. He spent hours at the shelter, listening to stories of people whose lives had unraveled in ways not so different from Clara's. Every face carried pain, yet there was warmth in the way Clara treated them, never as burdens but as equals. Adrian returned again and again, and with each visit his hardened edges softened. He no longer saw them as statistics but as human beings who deserved dignity. Inspired, he began funding programs, not just writing checks from a distance, but involving himself, asking what people truly needed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing profits or reputation, he was chasing meaning. Clara noticed the change in him. Where once his eyes were calculating and guarded, now they softened when he spoke to others. The cold, unreachable millionaire was slowly becoming a man who cared. Clara's own life began to transform too. With Adrian's support, she was able to step away from endless temporary jobs and return to her studies. Yet it wasn't the money that changed her path, it was the belief he placed in her. She often told him, "You didn't just give me opportunities, you reminded me I was worth them." Adrian, in turn, found himself admitting truths he had long buried, that wealth had filled his pockets but left his soul starved. Together, they created initiatives that not only fed the hungry but taught skills, built shelters, and gave people hope. And in every project, Clara stood at the forefront, a symbol of resilience. Months later, the world began to notice the transformation of Adrian Cole. Reporters were fascinated by the billionaire who suddenly devoted himself to humanitarian causes. At a press conference, surrounded by flashing cameras, he was asked why he had changed so drastically. Adrian didn't launch into statistics or speeches about corporate responsibility. Instead, he turned slightly toward Clara, who stood beside him, her presence steady, her smile quiet but powerful. "Because once," he said into the microphones, his voice carrying across the room, "someone asked me for leftovers. And instead, I found a reason to live." The words stunned the audience, many of whom had never seen such raw honesty from a man of his stature. From that moment, their bond was no longer just an unlikely friendship, it was a partnership built on compassion and trust. Clara, once invisible to the world, was now a voice of hope, reminding everyone that dignity mattered more than wealth. Adrian, once feared for his coldness, became admired for his humanity. Together, they showed that miracles weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they were as simple as a hungry girl asking for leftovers, and a man wealthy enough to ignore her choosing instead to see her. And in that choice, lives beyond their own were forever changed.